Hello everyone and welcome to another ride overview. Do you like roller coasters but wish that they included some reference to animals? Well, have I got the coaster type for you, the Wild Mouse Coaster. Sudden drops, tiny turns and endless possibilities for mouse related jokes. There truly is nothing cheesier. And even better, there are 3 varieties to choose from. The steel wild mouse, the wooden wild mouse and for the crazy folks out there, the spinning wild mouse. That's right, today we're going to discuss the 3 wild mouse coaster types. They are distinct types, but because they are so similar, I've decided to put them all together into one big video. I did already make a steel wild mouse overview 5 years ago, but that was my first ride overview ever and only 3.5 minutes long, so it really needs a proper do-over. There is also the inverted hairpin coaster, which is a 4th coaster type that's very similar, but I've already done an overview on that one a while ago. Wild mouse coasters are small coaster types that are usually compact and feature very tight turns. There are a few other coaster types that have access to these tiny turns, but they're most iconic on a wild mouse. Despite their small size, wild mouse coasters do have quite high stats, so you can charge a lot for them, making them good money makers. I mean, just look at this. For just €2,500 you can get a small coaster that can process about 2,600 guests per hour with a ticket price of over €15. And if this was the only steel wild mouse in the park, you could theoretically charge over $20 if the game allowed you to. Sure, there are microcoaster designs that do this far better, but those are a bit cheesy and can feel a bit scummy to use at times. The great thing about these wild mouse coasters is that their normal designs are this good. It's not about the stats or the throughput, as other coasters can do that too, but it's about getting that for so little money. All 3 wild mouse rides are great for this, but they do each have their own quirks and unique attributes, so let's start by taking a look at what track pieces they each have to offer. First, the steel wild mouse, as it has the most variety of the 3. Most steel wild mice start with a steep lift hill, which is quite a rare thing to see on a coaster type, but it's very useful. It allows you to get up high much quicker while using much less space. The small level to steep and steep to level track pieces make the chain lift even more space efficient, which also helps to make the ride more compact. Aside from the super common small turns, the wild mouse also gets the tiny turns, once again leaning into the compactness of the ride type. You do have to be quite careful with these though, as naturally they produce a lot of lateral g-forces. You can take unbanked small turns at up to 60 km per hour without getting excessive lateral g-forces, but tiny turns can only go up to 45 km per hour. This makes it very easy to go too fast and ruin your intensity rating. Banking these would help a lot, but unfortunately banked tiny turns don't exist and the wild mouse cannot bank their small turns either. They don't have access to steep turns, but the sloped small turns is available on the steel wild mouse, even though it's not used very often. Brakes are your best friend on this coaster, as putting them right before a turn can save you from those pesky excessive lateral g-forces. And that's all the interesting track pieces that it gets, with the steep chain lift, small level to steep transition pieces and tiny turns being the most notable and unique. It's not a lot of variety, but they do allow for a lot of different compact designs. The wooden wild mouse has access to the exact same track pieces except for 3 that it is missing. It doesn't have the sloped banked turn, which is not a big deal as it's not very commonly used on a steel wild mouse anyway. But more importantly, it doesn't have brakes, not regular ones and no block brakes. This makes controlling the speed in turns quite a bit more tricky and limits its possibilities. It also means that you cannot build designs with a short station and then a large amount of cars, as you need block brakes to do that. The spinning wild mouse does have brakes and block brakes, but it also misses sloped turns and unfortunately steep hills. This does make sense, as spinning down a steep hill doesn't seem very comfortable to me, but it does make the designs generally a bit less compact and efficient. It does get one extra track piece in the spinning control toggle, which stops the car from spinning and locks it into whatever position it's in when going over it. This sounds very neat, and it is from an aesthetics perspective, but just like the seat rotation on the multi-dimension coaster, the spinning has zero effect on anything whatsoever. The spinning wild mouse coaster does have a very high nausea rating, but that is baked into the vehicle, which gives 43% extra nausea, so it doesn't matter how much spinning you actually do. Speaking of stats, let's take a look at how these three compare. Here we have the same design for all three coaster types. Before we see their stats, I want to quickly look at their construction costs. The steel and spinning wild mouse coasters cost the same, which makes sense as they use the same track type, and the wooden wild mouse is ever so slightly cheaper. This doesn't tell the whole story though. The base cost of a wooden wild mouse track piece is about 10% cheaper than that of the steel wild mouse, but its supports are 3 euros per unit instead of the 2 euros of the steel one. So, closer to the ground the wooden is cheaper, and high in the air the steel wild mouse is cheaper. Ultimately this doesn't really matter as the difference is very small and all three types are always very cheap. Here are 4 identical designs built in different coaster types. The wild mouse costs about 1600 euros and is the cheapest of the bunch. The wooden coaster costs almost 50% more at 2300 euros. The looping coaster costs 2600 and the giga coaster is over twice as expensive as the wild mouse coaster at 3400 euros. So not only are wild mouse coasters usually quite small, the track pieces themselves are also very cheap, and both effects compound to make it an incredibly cheap coaster type. All three wild mice cost pretty much the same, but what about their stats? Well, those are also quite similar. In fact, if we put the same vehicle on all three rides to eliminate differences caused by that, we can see that the steel wild mouse and the spinning wild mouse are again identical. The wooden wild mouse has almost the same excitement and nausea ratings and a little bit more intensity, as wooden rides generally shake you around a bit more. If we put the correct vehicles on the wooden and spinning wild mice, we can see that the wooden wild mouse has a slightly higher excitement rating and slightly lower intensity and nausea ratings now. This is because the wooden mouse vehicle is quite a bit lighter, causing it to lose speed quicker, leading to lower g-forces and thus lower stats. But it also gives a 3% excitement boost, so the excitement rating ends up being a bit higher than before. The spinning wild mouse has significantly higher stats all around now, with almost 50% higher nausea. A small part of that is caused by slightly heavier cars, but it's mainly the stat bonuses of the spinning wild mouse vehicle that give it these higher stats. As mentioned before, it gives 43% extra nausea, but it also gives a little bit more excitement and intensity. The steel wild mouse and wooden wild mouse also have access to mine-themed vehicles. Those on the steel mouse are almost exactly identical to the mouse cars. They give the same stats on the same design, carry the same amount of guests and are the same size and weight. On the wooden wild mouse they are significantly different though. They are the same weight as the mouse cars, but are slightly bigger and give a 3% intensity boost instead of 3% excitement. Most importantly though, they can have 2 cars per train instead of just 1, which doubles the weight and makes it maintain speed for much longer. As you can see, it gets higher stats and a shorter ride time, along with a greater capacity, as one 2-car train takes up less space on the station than 2 1-car trains. Unless these extra stats give you an extreme intensity rating, there is no reason to ever not use the 2-car train in paper ride parks. Speaking of the capacity of the wooden wild mouse, it is significantly worse than the other two. The steel and spinning wild mouse vehicles all sit 4 people per car, but the wooden wild mouse ones only sit 2. Even with the 2-car trains, this still leads to a lower capacity and throughput, which is not a problem in pay-for-entry parks, but it is a significant downside in paper ride parks. Just like with all the other ride types that have lots of small vehicles instead of a few longer trains, you want to build the entrance building as close to the front of the station as possible and remove the minimum wait time requirement. That last one is especially important, and leaving it at the default 10 seconds of waiting time can completely kill your throughput. The wooden wild mouse on the left here gets about 600 guests per hour, and the identical one on the right gets more than double that because it doesn't have most of its cars being useless in the station all of the time. The mouse coasters come with a lot of stat requirements. The steel and spinning ones both need to have a drop of at least 4 meters, at least 2 drops, a top speed of at least 25 km per hour, a length of at least 170 meters and at least 1.5 lateral Gs. For every requirement you don't make, your excitement, intensity and nausea ratings get divided by 2, so if you fill them all they will be completely annihilated. The wooden wild mouse is even worse. It needs a 6 meter drop instead of 4, it needs 3 instead of 2 drops, and it has an additional stat requirement of at least 0.1 negative Gs. This makes it the only coaster type in the game, along with the inverted hairpin coaster, to have 6 stat requirements. If you fill them all, you can manage to get a combined EIN rating of a terrifyingly low 0.13. Now that we know the stat requirements they all have, the time has come to take a look at some efficient designs, to which you can find a download link in the description. Usually there is some super cheap design that I recommend using, but not this time. Sure, these 3 designs do pass all stat requirements and thus have decent stats, but their throughput is terrible with only 2 cars. If you're just building them for the extra soft guest cap, you're better off just building a few tiny circles. They have super low stats but still attract the same 55 guests each. That is one of the downsides of the wild mouse coasters, by the way. Most coaster types attract between 80 and 100 guests, so you'll need almost twice as many wild mice to achieve the same effect. The smallest steel wild mouse that I do recommend is this iconic 4x4 design. With a clever use of some block brakes, it hosts 6 cars and gets a throughput of nearly 900 guests an hour. That's not a lot in isolation, but it's a very cheap and very small design, so it's not bad for its price and size. The block brakes do add some delay between cars, which is why just using a long station is much more efficient. This design is still very small and can process nearly 3 times the amount of guests per hour, with of course some higher stats and thus a higher maximum ticket price. It's a fantastic small design and you'll never go wrong with this. If you do need something bigger with more intensity, then this is the best design to use. It has over 7 excitement and over 9 intensity, which is ideal for parks where guests prefer more intense rides. And even this design still costs less than 4,000 euros. The wooden wild mouse unfortunately cannot pull off the same 4x4 design as the steel one. This is partly because it needs a 6 meter drop, which requires one side to be at least 5 tiles long, but the lack of block brakes is a much bigger problem. Because this means that you can only get 2 cars on the track, which gives a maximum throughput of less than 350 guests per hour, and that really makes this design not worth it. This design is much better though, which is unsurprising as it's an exact copy of the efficient steel wild mouse design and it works just as well. The only difference is the much lower throughput due to the vehicles only having space for 2 guests instead of 4. It only gets up to about 1,500 guests per hour instead of 2,500. For the big design this is even worse. This one is different from the steel wild mouse as the wooden one has a slightly lower support limit and different vehicle weights. The stats are higher, but the longer station isn't enough to compensate for the longer ride time and the throughput is only about 1,300 guests per hour. I designed this coaster to work with both the single cars and 2-car trains, which was quite tricky. On one hand I had to take the massive speed loss of the empty, very light single car into account, while also making sure that the 2-car train didn't go too fast in turns at the end. Brakes would have made this so much easier, but unfortunately those aren't available. This, combined with the very mediocre throughput, makes the wooden wild mouse the worst of the 3 in my opinion. Although what it does have is steep slopes, which the spinning wild mouse lacks. This means that the block brake design is even larger at 6x4 tiles, but it does get a throughput of over 1000 guests per hour, which is more than the 4x4 steel wild mouse. Once again, the most efficient design is a small compact one with a fairly long station. It reaches a throughput of about 2300 guests per hour and has a good maximum ticket price. Do make sure to have a handyman nearby to deal with all the puke though, as there will be a lot. Just like for the steel wild mouse, the large design is very similar to the efficient design, as it's just a bit bigger with a bit higher stats and the same throughput. Great for making money, this one. Lastly, there are the designs for parks that have harder guest generation enabled. In those scenarios, to get a soft guest cap of over 1000 guests, you need rides that are at least 600 meters long and have at least 6 excitement. So I designed one that achieves that with the smallest footprint possible for all 3 mouse coasters. The combination of the steep lift hill and the higher support limit allowed a 3x9 footprint for the steel wild mouse, while the others have to do it with a 4x9 footprint. The throughput on these rides aren't terrible, so these are still decent rides, even if they're a bit ugly. In conclusion, the wild mouse coasters are amazing for building small compact coaster designs. Their high stats combined with a cheap cost makes them great money makers and easy to afford when starting out in a scenario. I'm always happy when I see one of these in my ride selection, and I hope you are now too. To see my previous ride overview, which was on the inverted impulse coaster, click right here. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.